So, I mean, it's just clear. We're sitting at a critical juncture, a critical historic moment where we're changing the energy base of our economy. That's happened maybe twice or three times in human history. Clearly, the era of industrialization and mechanization is one. I would say ending slavery was another change to the energy base of our economy. This is equally significant. And we're right in the middle of that transition. In the current era, though, we're no longer at the stage of trying to curb or limit the pollution of the fossil fuel industry. We are actually at the point where we must decisively and clearly end the fossil fuel era. Full stop. And that is our charge and our moment in history. The management of the industry's wind down will really determine the extent to which we have climate impacts and grotesque human suffering. It will determine how workers are treated in the transition, and it will determine the degree to which other industries dependent on fossil fuels will evolve with positive disruption as opposed to negative disruption. That's how critical this transition is, and that's how critical our thinking should be about it. Also, the degree to which we accelerate that transition through renewables and decarbonization of all industries will determine how quickly and how effectively we make that transition, and therefore how much we limit the worst impacts of climate change. So, however, while we might all in this room recognize the urgency and the inevitability of the transition, as Mark said, apparently the fossil fuel industry and its execs still don't. They're largely still trying to outlive the political pressure even after the Paris moment, although their rhetoric may be changing. Their practices are not fundamentally. They have a history of denying the science and promoting the denial of that science. And they have not committed probably to the most significant thing, which Mark just cited, don't worry, is to end the CapEx. And really when we look at the amount of money that's flowing still into new projects, new exploration of fossil fuels, into financing the so-called carbon bombs, it is absolutely an ethical and moral imperative that we stop the capital expenditures and protect some of the most critical areas in the planet. And it's actually the recalcitrance of the industry over the last 20 or 30 years to accept the reality of the science of climate change that led to this movement calling for divestment and investment. It began on a few college campuses in the United States in 2011. About 8 campuses, activists from 8 campuses came together around the idea of a coal divestment campaign based largely just on ethical grounds and calling for their universities to invest in climate solutions. It went quickly to 40 or 50 campuses in one academic year, and then magic happened. Bill McKibben lifted up the incredible analysis from Carbon Tracker and published a high-profile article in Rolling Stone, and 40 campuses went to 400 overnight. And quickly the movement spread to faith groups, cities, pension funds, hospital endowments. It moved from the US globally, and now I would say it's expanded to the point where there's powerful trajectories coming out of the movement with activists tackling banks through the divestment frame that are financing major projects, and the momentum keeps growing. In December at the Paris conference, we had a tally at that point of over 500 institutions, thousands of individuals that have committed to divest and invest, and committed publicly and explicitly, not just through their practices, but made a public commitment. The tally of assets under management of institutions with public commitments to some form of divestment had exceeded $3.4 trillion. Now that is some significant money for a movement that started in 2011. And it's still not nearly enough, but many of the investors that made a public commitment committed on ethical grounds, some made a commitment on financial grounds, and others made the commitment for both financial and ethical reasons. My foundation has supported this movement from the very first campus campaigns, and along with Sarah and other institutions, we too had already committed our own investment portfolio to complete fossil fuel divestment. And you know, in the Q&A, if you want to know, I can tell the story about our financial performance. We're crushing our benchmarks. We're over 11% invested in climate solutions, and we're doing just fine. The water is tepid. Come on in, no problem. So from Archbishop Tutu to insurance companies to pension funds to Rockefeller philanthropic institutions whose wealth was built on Standard Oil, the movement has exploded. I would say, in essence, it's a people's lever of climate finance. A people's lever of climate finance was built using political, moral, ethical, and financial pressure to move the money in larger institutions. And this people's lever of climate finance has already had tremendous success. Those financing the energy transition, those that are beginning to move their money into the climate solutions will stand to profit and prosper from getting in early and capturing the upside. And those that got out of fossil fuels, particularly those that got out early, protected their assets before coal tanked, before oil tanked. And regardless of whether we see a short-term bump in oil and gas, it will only be a short-term bump at best. And so those that have not divested are only standing to see significant further losses in your portfolio. Because come on, admit it. You've had losses if you held on to coal and to oil. So those that get out now can still protect their assets from further risk, and those that are investing both in renewables and clean tech and decarbonization technologies will clearly benefit over the long term. But I'd like to turn to the ethical issues that are raised. I don't have any idea how long I've been talking.
Yeah, you've probably got about a minute.
Okay, but I'll do it quickly. I'll do a quick minute. The speed at which we move the resources out of fossil fuels and into climate solutions will determine how much of the world avoids climate impacts. That's a truism. But additionally, we must define the universe of invest and invest opportunities to consciously include addressing energy poverty. As part of the agenda, it has to be explicit from the outset. Particularly for mission-driven institutions, it's a profound issue whether we include in the energy transition those who lack access to energy today, who can leapfrog, as Mark said, fossil fuel development, and bypass disastrous health and environmental consequences from fossil fuel development. We can address climate change and poverty through impact investments for energy access to create economic opportunities for the 1.5 billion and to meet their fundamental human rights. Because let's be clear, you cannot achieve the right to health, to education, or an adequate standard of living without the right to power, without access to energy. Many who may profit from large-scale renewable deployment, we will profit, but we must also put up the capital to achieve energy access. Even if that means we accept a lower market rate of return for those impact investments, they won't all be lower market rate of return, but even if we do, that is an ethical imperative. A number of institutions that have been involved in the Divest Invest movement, from philanthropy and faith, are launching a new campaign calling for a campaign to end energy poverty, and we're calling on mission-based institutions to put up a percent of their of investments and grants, however they choose to blend that, and move capital over the next 15 years so that we end energy poverty by 2030 and meet the Sustainable Development Goal number 7. I hope that everybody in this room will see it as both their moral imperative and a historic role to be part of this energy transition, because much like slavery and much like other critical issues of the past, where you stand on this issue at this moment in time will be one for the history books. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna Mark, and hello. I feel a little bit like a civilian caught in a war, and I think we have two generals here. My brief was to provoke rather than to inform, and I'm about to go a little bit off-piste. If you want the sort of logical, referenced account of what I'm about to say, it is in this report. There are no royalties for this. I've already written it. There's no financial interest. There are some hard copies around, and it's also freely available online. It's a report called Money Talks. Because my brief was to help you get to the point of, if you understand climate change, divestment sort of falls like a ripe fruit out of that understanding. I want to think about what it means to understand climate change, because it's highly non-trivial. And I want to begin with a metaphor that might be salient given that we've just had lunch. And bear with me here. Climate change is a bit like a 7 flavors sandwich. We've just looked at that sandwich over there and we've thought, what is this exactly? Some have said, is this feta, blah, 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 blah. Is this, what kind of bread is this, and so forth. So let me run this by you. The middle bit is the important bit, the filling. The filling is where the flavor comes from. And I'm going to say in a minute that the flavor is money. And money is what we're here to talk about today. But I want to speak about the loaves of bread and the 3 ingredients on each of them on other sides. On the bottom you have the kind of inspirational stuff that we just heard about. It's the democracy and the culture and the behavior. It's the civic society. It's the Bill McKibben movements. It's the kind of ethical imperative that says climate change is a real and present danger and we have to act on it for moral reasons. Those are the kind of softer, more adaptive, more cultural aspects of climate change. And there again, behavior, culture, and democracy. So think of that as your ingredients for your under loaf of the sandwich. And your top loaf is the harder stuff. That's the science, the data that tells you this is what the carbon budget is. Or the data that tells you this is how long we have, this is how bad a 2-degree world is, this is how bad a 3-degree world is, and so forth. And then we have the technology, what is possible. And technology, of course, is never a standalone question. Technology lives or dies depending on its capital. And the third you have is law. Paris was, to some people, an extraordinary breakthrough, to others, an overpromise and something that we can't possibly deliver. But in any case, you have in that image of climate change to understand that you have these hard technical sides of the issue. People who come suited and booted and telling you, look, climate change is really about redirecting capital. It's really about this law. It's really about this technology and the viability of storage or solar or wind or whatever. But you also have the civilians. You have the people who are saying, I want to get my politicians into this issue. I need to have the political capital so that we can get less subsidies on the issue. And you also have the cultural issue of where is climate change? There's a socially constructed silence on the issue. Why am I not seeing it in soap operas? Why am I not seeing it on the national news more regularly? And then on behavior, it's like, well, what on earth do I do? And that's why when you frame it in that big picture of the two loaves of bread, the hard stuff and the soft stuff, the money in the middle really matters. The capital in the middle, you can think of it, I don't know how it tastes to you, but something that tastes good, hopefully. This money really determines what happens with that picture. And it's a systemic understanding. So I want you to think of climate change in that way. It has 7 different flavors, 7 different ingredients. Okay? It's not one thing. It was a great tragedy for the world that climate change was ever thought of as an environmental issue. Mm-hmm. Because it just isn't. It's a systemic, deep human issue that affects every aspect of our lives, both in cause and consequence. Now that's the first metaphor. The second one. Some of you have the experience of a fly coming into your apartment and struggling to get it out again. How do you do it exactly? It has its own will. Contrast that with if you have an object of your own. Let's say I want to hit that emergency exit sign. I can lift up an object and throw it and try and hit there. And okay, with a bit of practice, I might get it eventually. Because in essence, the object won't have a will of its own. But imagine this is a bird and I want to get it over there. Or imagine the bird comes into your apartment and you want to get it out of the window. You're dealing with a living system with wills of its own, ideas of its own, and so forth. Now, where is climate change in this? We often imagine that with climate change you can somehow pull a lever and solve the problem. But that's not it at all. And divestment is deeply misunderstood as a one-lever answer. As if somehow all that happens with divestment is you make the fossil fuel companies somehow go bankrupt, which feels wildly implausible. And that somehow then all the money goes towards renewable energy. We have a 100% renewable energy world and everyone is happy. Of course, it's several orders of magnitude more complex than that. But the bird analogy is a way of saying, look, you can't really force the bird to get to the other side unless you kill it. Right? You can kill the bird, make it a dead object, and then throw it and you might have some luck. But that denatures the thing that you care about. In the same way, we can't just turn off the fossil fuels immediately. And the idea that we can is absurd and self-defeating. What we can do is build something over on the other side that the bird wants to get to. Build some trees, build some branches, build those solar power plants, show a whole city on renewables, inspire it to go over there of its own accord. But don't think that you can force the issue. And then the final metaphor is the toughest one. I think this is one that we'll maybe talk about later. It's about how do we feel about the fossil fuel industry? Because I've heard voices that say these are unambiguously the bad guys. They are devil incarnate, Hitler, and so forth. Not so sure. Our lives are completely complicit in fossil fuels. We depend upon them. I wouldn't be who I am today without them. I rely on them when I go home tonight. They are something that is, part of the world and will remain part of the world for the short term. But the question is, how short is the short term? So then the metaphor for me is fossil. I wanted you to imagine that this group is not just in this conference room, but in a pub later on, and we've had a great party together, and we're having a great time, and the alcohol is flowing, and we're all a little bit merry. And we notice that there's one guy at the bar, and he probably is a guy, and he probably is in a suit, and he's probably quite tall, and he might have an American accent. But this person, he's clearly had a few drinks too many. He's a bit lost, a bit bewildered. And I want you to think of him as a wayward uncle. You discover we're all kind of related to him in some way. And that actually this person gave us this party. He paid for it. He got the alcohol. He got the premises. He made it all happen for us. And we were all very happy with our lives because of him. But then I want you to imagine that he looks a bit dejected. And he's dejected because he's drunk too much. He's overdone it, just as we've overdone it with fossil fuels. And the question then is, you go up to him and say, look, I think you've had enough. I think we need to take you home now. You've drunk too much. That's what we're sort of saying with the fossil fuel companies. Not so much, you're evil, I'm going to kill you, but let's escort you out quietly and try and move on to something else. Now, the problem there is the fossil fuel person, the wayward uncle, might well say, well, I don't have anywhere else to go. I don't have anywhere else to go. And this is why there's enormous resistance in the fossil fuel industry. So those three things are what I want to share. 7-flavor sandwich, getting a bird to the other side of the room, and a wayward uncle and what we do with them. Thanks very much.